Last year, at one of the keynotes, I believe, but at one of the addresses, and if anybody remembers who did this, please let me know because I'd love to include it in the final version of the slides. Somebody mentioned serendipity and referred to Walpole's Three Princes of Serendip. And I thought that although this was as I remember, the discussion was excellent, it was incomplete. So I decided that instead of being ridiculous, oh, come on, go away, that it would be worthwhile to look at exactly how we try to foster serendipity in students, colleagues, teams, communities. And so initially, as I said, serendipity, the fortunate happenstance or pleasant surprise, the word comes from Walpole's novel, The Three Princes of Serendip, in which the three princes are always making discoveries by talking to people, observing things around them, making discoveries by accidents and sagacity of things they were not in quest of, but which of course later turn out to be valuable because basically it is lore, it's legend being written by Walpole. Merriam-Webster defines it as the faculty or phenomenon of finding valuable or agreeable things not sought for. So I have a number of quotes which tie this to creativity, to making connections, and there's some serendipity in here. The Henry Ford quote comes because I happen to be a fan of crypto quotes in the local paper. And a couple of days after I set the final version of this, I'm doing a crypto quote and the quote pops up. The last one, I'm reading a blog and somebody decides on Kant's birthday to do a retrospective of some of his major ideas. So if you're thinking about things, connections will occur when you're not looking for them. And of course, there's a lot of history in this. The discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming by finding the culture, the region on his Petri dish in which there was no bacteria because there was a small penicillin culture. Goodyear spilling rubber on his stove. Plunkett discovering Teflon through a very similar situation. And likewise, insight, you just think about things in the background and all of a sudden things occur. The most famous example is possibly apocryphal, but Keukeler's vision of the snake swallowing itself, connecting back to the organic structure of the benzene ring. Personally, I once took a course on computational geometry because I liked the professor, no better reason. And later, about 15 years later, I was working on a problem in real-time scheduling where the aim was to try to minimize the delay on multimedia channels by keeping all of the channels as synchronized as possible. And it turned out the scheduling algorithm was almost exactly the algorithm one uses to optimize the line segment intersection problem. And, you know, who would have thought it? This insight, this analogy, this serendipity is closely related to thought experiments, the what-if sense. And the last level or nature I would suggest is that that the princes got a lot of that information, a lot of that serendipity happened because they talked to people. and community, multiple viewpoints, in fact, in both the talks this morning, we've heard of this, and integration of viewpoints, whether deliberate or just sort of pleasant, leads to very significant information. So Walpole talks about accident and sagacity. We can't really subdivide or plan for accident, right? Things that happen by pure chance are going to happen or not happen, and the only thing you can do is not stay locked up in your room, but go out and experience things. But sagacity is not a simple thing. It's going to subsume knowledge, wisdom, openness, the use of analogy, and reflection. By the way, as I started preparing this talk, in fact, I hate to confess, I'm a member of a book club, and I failed to return the book club membership card quickly enough, and this book came. And it turns out to be a very, very nice fit. The Hofstadter book, you may remember, he was the author of Gödel, Escher, Bach, which tried to connect Gödel's incompleteness theorem with Escher's infinite drawings with Bach's fugues. And he starts talking about analogy in two different works. The earlier work is basically on how artificial intelligence uses analogy. The later work, and I've got about halfway through, I admit, is talking about language and thought and the fact that we construct frames from partial frames we've built. We integrate things on the spur of the moment, filling in and creating categories, broadening and specializing categories, intersecting categories, making a category out of, he's a Fred. He has this characteristic of Fred that we've all thought of, we've described. He is the Rissa of his engineering group, because that is something that we all have a knowledge of, and it's a way of saying something very important in a few words. And it might not be the same meaning for the same person, Rissa, that I would use if I were talking in a culinary context. I recommend the book. There's a lot of laundry lists in there, I'm afraid, but it's going to make you think about things. Okay, one of the things he talks about is how we have hierarchies. Some of these hierarchies we've learned, but in thinking about things, we may use the full hierarchy, we may even refine it further, or we may tend to use, as in the red, subcategories and not be thinking, and this is how you would teach a 6th or 7th grade sort of geometry, but not formal geometry, practical geometry class, to distinguish shapes, maybe it's 4th grade even. And you would not say in that class that a square was a parallelogram. You'd want them to say the parallelogram is the nearest pattern that this matches, and so you would use only the red categories. Okay, so I'm going to look at 3 modes, or the individual mode, and what do we do to get people to prepare to make these accidental discoveries, these analogies, these insights. Well, you need mental flexibility. You need to be in touch with your senses. Thinking in the background, I'm sure many people here have been dealing with a paper or a product, and as you're going to sleep or waking up or getting out of the shower, all of a sudden you say, oh, my. And of course, about 75% of that you either forget or you realize a minute later is total nonsense, but 25% is very valuable. Recognizing the unexpected. You cannot benefit from the unexpected if you don't notice it's happened, and if you don't notice that it's significant. Isaac Asimov said, more good science happens because people say, oh, that's strange, than because they said, aha, or they made careful plans. You have to be able to assess the unexpected. Just because it's happened doesn't mean it fits, doesn't mean it's valuable, but doesn't mean it's worthless either. You have to adapt to it, incorporate it if it fits in what you're in the pieces that you're doing, and you have to evaluate after you've done it whether it really did fit and how well it fit and whether it's the best alternative and whether that's finished or you need to do something still more. And as the Agile people know, we always need to do something more. And if we don't realize it, somebody's going to realize it for us. And if they don't realize it, our competitors will. Okay, whether the competitors are in the mental world of reputation or the real world of making money. Okay, then we have preparing to collaborate, form communities, interact, exchange. So communities may come together without total planning, or they may come together in a formal way and form a community without planning. Those of you who were at yesterday's workshop, I think, saw a community forming that nobody expected to form. I mean, we were hoping, but I don't think you did. Serendipitous conversation and communication. I have gone, as again I recommended at the workshop yesterday, to talks here and at other conferences that appeared to have nothing to do with what I was doing, but the title sounded interesting, or the talk was between two that I was interested in, or the talk was in a session where I went as courtesy to some of my friends, and all of a sudden I said, you know, that's interesting, I can use that. Okay, serendipitous, multiple viewpoints. Accept and integrate views. People are going to ask us questions in a few minutes, and we're going to say, you know, that's interesting. We can use that. Or maybe people will ask Fred a question, and somebody in the audience will say, you know, that would make a damn good paper. Well, go ahead. Okay. Leverage analyses and transformation. And one of my favorite phrases from a classic play, Marat Sade, which is very strange, performance of a play on the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, performed by the inmates of the asylum of Charenton under the direction of the Marquis de Sade. But there's a phrase that keeps occurring. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, turn yourself inside out, and take a good look at the world. The inversion of the internal and the external view. And when you make connections, evaluate them, stick to them. Okay. Interdisciplinary mode, by the way, anybody who wants these slides before Najib publishes them, I'll be happy to give you a copy. Anybody who doesn't, I'll still be happy to give you a copy, but that's okay. There are going to be, again, one of the wonderful things about this conference is it brings together all sorts of people. If you listen, right, you can learn a lot just by listening. They that have ears, let them hear. Out of the mouth of babes. Be glad you're in communities. By the way, I'm also trying to advertise delivery in a non-monotone. Okay. Framework and process, right? Knowledge bases, knowledge of all kinds. Explicit, what we know and we describe. Implicit, what we know and haven't described. And tacit, what we know and can't describe. Okay. I make a big deal, as those who've been here for years have heard me say, of requirements and risk. You always want to think. Just because you're hoping for fortunate accidents or just because you can take advantage of fortunate accidents doesn't mean you shouldn't think about what your problem is first. The more slots you identify and leave open, the easier they are to fill. You may indeed have a conversation that changes the way you think about the problem. Maybe it is right to go back and reorganize. The better you've analyzed the problem, as long as you're not religiously committed to it, the easier it will be to do that. In fact, I think I have the time. I'm going to throw in my 6 rules of software engineering. Actually, I call them 4 rules, but there are 6 of them. It doesn't start with the coding. It doesn't end with the coding. It's not all coding while you're coding. Don't forget about the coding. No one approach fits all problems. And most importantly, it's an approach, damn it, not a religion. Don't stick faithfully to it when it doesn't fit. Okay, conceptual framework. If we're going to teach people serendipity, teach people to appreciate and anticipate and benefit from serendipity, they need to have critical thinking and problem-solving skills. Agility, which we've heard about twice already this morning, particularly in the software engineering or engineering way, the partial requirements, the discovery of requirements and knowledge, the deferring details until they become important. But don't forget to figure out what you're doing first, right? And continued assessment, testing, validation, feedback. Openness and flexibility, willingness to be wrong. That's both the Ford quote, and we've again seen that both times this morning. Be glad to explore partially correct approaches, or approaches that fit your problem but aren't really the right one. You'll learn an awful lot. Don't get committed to them. Don't waste your time on them if they're not, when you find they're not working. Oh, but we put 10 years and 10 million. Yeah, forget it. And again, analogy, generalization, and the dynamic creation of mental frames. And organizational structures. Don't be afraid sometimes, when necessary, to break that structure and reform it. Very, very important. Again, for the workshop, people who were there at the workshop yesterday. Have fun. Don't go in thinking this is all a bore. You've got to get it done. When the day's over, thank God. If you're not playing around with ideas and enjoying talking to your colleagues most of the time, everybody has a headache now and then. Everybody has a colleague who's a pain now and then, and I'm sure I've been one. But if you're not having fun, don't do it. Okay. Planning because it's interesting as well as important and useful. Interaction, revision. Listening, communication, persuasiveness without being overbearing or dogmatic. Experimentation and exploration. And I bet you knew I would say this, humor and perspective. And as I said, sensory awareness. Be aware of what's happening. And if you get something that is going around in your mind in the background and it comes to the front, unless there's a fire or something, stop and think about it. Okay. Form your communities. By the way, if you notice these last several slides, all of the words end in "you'll," and that's because you all better be doing this. Okay? You have to have adaptive networks and collaborations, welcome partners, welcome ideas from outside, welcome ideas from your customer, your client, your manager, your developer, your supplier. If the secretary comes up with a good idea, use it and give him or her credit. Develop culture and trust. Reward trust. Reward people who contribute. The best managers are those who try to give their subordinates credit. In fact, even if you give them a little more than they deserve, that's not the worst thing in the world. Aim for multiple modes of communication. Multiple narrative styles. For one thing, people learn differently. People think differently. For another, you'll wake them up. Though maybe once in a while you want to know how to put them to sleep as well. Okay. Look at notations and diagrams. Try to pick the ones that are best for what you're trying to convey. Sometimes, as you notice, you can have images that either for humor or illustration just add connotations or overtones to what you're saying. Those aren't terrible, as long as you don't try to focus too much on them. And again, abstraction, generalization, specialization, intersection, and analogy. Well, that comes up a lot, doesn't it? Consensual framework. Community judgment, but also not groupthink. Now, wait a minute. You know, maybe we ought to step back for a minute here. And you've got to foster a community structure where that's possible. Got to foster a community structure where somebody can say to the teacher, you know, I'd like that explained differently. Or even, I'm not sure that's right. And the teacher isn't going to take out that big club that's hiding over in the corner. Okay, encourage participation and growth and develop communities And don't be afraid of overlapping communities. Of course, the lawyers may be shuddering in the back of the room, and there are cases where you have to give the lawyers their due. IP is always a mess. And eventual framework, I'm not sure eventual is the right word, but I couldn't come up with another you-all. And it sounds good anyway. In the long run, judge and reflect, figure out what you've done, figure out whether it's right, reflect on both the process and the product, reflect on the relationships with people. All of this stuff they tell you in software engineering, take it seriously for a change. Maintenance and evolution, look what you've done, keep it working, make it better. Sometimes go back and refactor, redo to improve how it works, either because all your changes have made it terribly messy or because the technological platform has changed and you can now do it better. Knowledge and judgment evolve. You're getting better, I hope. You're learning more. I'm trying to learn more. And take a stand when you have to. Know when things are ridiculous. Okay, knowledge management, to connect people, to reveal connections. Okay, there is support. We need more. Anyone who's got a bright idea out of any of the talks today for more support for serendipity and discovery and insight and innovation and collaboration and community, please go out and develop them. Right? We'll all thank you. And so there's 2 papers. Again, a workshop I went to only because I met somebody at another conference, and 2 valuable papers. And notice that there are things that we still aren't doing that well. And again, anyone who has ideas of how to support this, go right ahead. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susu, my frequent colleague, Visoka Karova, and one of my colleagues at Seton Hall, Dr. Karen Gewirtz, as well as whichever one of last year's presenters gave me the idea for this talk. Thank you.